The cabin sat like a wounded animal against the Colorado Rockies, its broken shutters flapping in the mountain wind. Sarah Martinez clutched her swollen belly as she stepped onto the rotting porch, keys trembling in her frozen fingers. At 8 months pregnant and homeless, this was her last refuge, a crumbling inheritance she'd bought sight unseen after her own children turned their backs on her. The memory of Marcus's words still stung like a fresh wound. "You're an embarrassment, Mom. First the scandal at Yale, now this pregnancy at 53? We can't have you around Emma and Jake." Her daughter Jessica had been even crueler, her voice cold as winter stone. "Find somewhere else to have your midlife crisis, baby. We're done enabling your poor choices." Poor choices. Sarah almost laughed at the bitter irony as she wrestled with the ancient lock. Her poor choice had been trusting the wrong colleague, Dr. Richard Hawthorne, who'd stolen her research and falsely accused her of selling artifacts to private collectors. The ethics committee hadn't cared about the truth, only the headlines. 25 years of impeccable scholarship destroyed in 6 months of accusations and innuendo. The door groaned open, releasing the musty scent of decades. Weak afternoon sunlight filtered through cracked windows, illuminating an interior that time had forgotten. Sarah stepped inside, her archaeologist's instincts immediately overriding her exhaustion. The real estate listing had mentioned rustic charm and original period details, but this was something else entirely. The pottery shards weren't random debris. They were deliberately placed, almost ceremonially arranged, near what had once been a fireplace. Sarah knelt carefully, her pregnant belly making the movement awkward, and picked up a fragment with reverent fingers. The distinctive black-on-white geometric patterns made her heart skip. Ancestral Puebloan, possibly Chaco Canyon origin, dating between 1050 to 1130 CE. "Impossible," she whispered, but her trained eye didn't lie. This single shard belonged in a museum, not scattered on the floor of an abandoned Colorado cabin. Her gaze traveled upward to the wooden beams, where carved symbols caught the dying light. Not random settler scratches, but deliberate petroglyphic forms, spirals, handprints, and clan markers that spoke of sacred spaces and hidden meanings. Sarah's pulse quickened as she recognized the pattern. These weren't decorative carvings, they were a map. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if sensing her excitement. Sarah pressed a hand to her belly, whispering, "I know, little one. Mama's found something special." She spent the next hour in a careful survey of the main room, photographing everything with her phone despite the weak signal. Behind a loose floorboard near the eastern wall, her fingers discovered the first complete piece, a bowl so perfectly preserved it seemed to glow in the amber light. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, the geometric patterns flowing with mathematical precision that spoke of master artisans. Sarah's hands shook as she cradled the bowl. Conservative estimate, $2 to $3 million. But the monetary value paled beside the historical significance. This piece could rewrite theories about trade routes, cultural exchange, even the mysterious abandonment of the great pueblos. As darkness crept across the mountains, Sarah forced herself to stop searching and focus on basic survival. She'd brought sleeping bags, canned food, and battery-powered lanterns. The cabin had no electricity, no running water, and winter was tightening its grip on the peaks above. While heating soup on a camping stove, she tried calling her children one last time. Marcus's phone went straight to voicemail. Jessica didn't even answer. The loneliness hit harder than the mountain cold, but Sarah pushed it away. She'd survived the Yale scandal alone. She could survive this. The bowl sat on the rough wooden table, seeming to watch her with ancient eyes. Sarah photographed it from every angle, documenting the find with professional thoroughness. But as she reviewed the images, a chill that had nothing to do with altitude ran down her spine. The snow outside held tracks that weren't hers, boot prints circling the cabin, pausing at windows, leading to and from the tree line. Someone had been here recently, watching, waiting. Sarah checked the locks, such as they were, and positioned her lantern away from the windows. Her academic mind catalogued possibilities, random hikers, local teenagers, even park rangers checking on the property. But her instincts, honed by years of working in remote archaeological sites where valuable artifacts attracted dangerous attention, screamed warning. The baby shifted restlessly in her womb, as if picking up on her tension. Sarah stroked her belly soothingly while her eyes remained fixed on the windows. "It's okay, sweetheart. Mama's going to figure this out." Outside, wind howled through pine trees, and somewhere in that vast darkness, Sarah was certain someone was planning their next move. The question wasn't whether they'd return, but when, and what they'd do to claim the fortune hidden in these ancient walls. The gravel road to the cabin stretched endlessly before Margaret's sedan, each pothole sending a jolt through her swollen belly. She pressed one hand against her stomach, whispering apologies to the baby inside for the rough journey ahead, both literal and metaphorical. The GPS had lost signal 20 minutes ago, leaving her with only hand-drawn directions her late husband had sketched on the back of an envelope years earlier. Douglas had inherited the mountain property from his grandfather, but never spoke much about it. Just an old hunting cabin, he'd always said when she suggested they visit. Nothing worth seeing up there. Now, with nowhere else to turn and her savings account dangerously thin, it represented her only refuge from the storm her children had created. The trees grew denser as the road climbed, their branches forming a canopy so thick that afternoon felt like twilight. Margaret's hands tightened on the steering wheel as she navigated another sharp curve. She wasn't built for this kind of isolation anymore, not at 62 and pregnant with what the doctors diplomatically called a geriatric pregnancy. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was fleeing to the mountains to hide her condition like some teenager from a bygone era. When the cabin finally came into view, Margaret's heart sank. The structure looked like it might collapse with the next strong wind. Weathered wooden siding had turned silver grey, and the porch sagged on one side where a support beam had rotted through. Weeds grew waist-high around the foundation, and several windows were cracked or missing entirely. This was supposed to be her sanctuary? She parked beside a rusted water pump and sat for a moment, gathering courage. The silence was absolute. No traffic, no neighbors, no sounds of civilization, just the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. For someone who had spent 4 decades in suburbia, the quiet felt oppressive rather than peaceful. The front door key was exactly where Douglas had said it would be, hidden under a loose stone near the steps. The lock protested but eventually yielded, and the door swung open with a groan that seemed to echo through the entire structure. Margaret stepped inside and immediately sneezed as dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight streaming through dirty windows. The main room was sparse but functional. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by built-in shelves filled with old hunting magazines and paperback novels. A kitchenette occupied the far corner, its avocado green appliances suggesting the cabin hadn't been updated since the 1970s. Margaret tested the light switch and was surprised when a ceiling fan lurched to life, wobbling ominously but providing some relief from the stale air. She spent the next hour taking inventory of her new home. The bedroom was barely large enough for the twin bed and dresser it contained. The bathroom featured a shower stall that had seen better days and a mirror so spotted with age that her reflection looked like a ghost. But the water ran clear when she turned the taps, and the electricity seemed to work throughout the cabin. It wasn't much, but it was habitable. As evening approached, Margaret sat on the front porch steps with a cup of instant coffee, watching shadows lengthen across the clearing. The baby moved inside her, a fluttering reminder of why she was here. She placed both hands on her belly and tried to imagine explaining this situation to her child someday. How do you tell someone that their older siblings, people old enough to be their parents, had been so ashamed of their existence that they'd driven their mother into exile? The sound of an engine interrupted her brooding. Margaret tensed as headlights swept across the trees, but the vehicle continued past without stopping. Still, the brief intrusion reminded her how vulnerable she was out here. No cell service, no neighbors within shouting distance, and the nearest town at least 30 minutes away on treacherous mountain roads. That night, she lay in the narrow bed listening to the cabin settle around her. Every creak and groan seemed amplified in the darkness. She'd always been a light sleeper, but now anxiety and pregnancy combined to keep her staring at the ceiling for hours. When she finally drifted off, her dreams were filled with disappointed faces and angry voices, her children's accusations echoing through her subconscious. She woke before dawn to the sound of something moving outside. Margaret held her breath, straining to identify the noise. Footsteps? An animal? The sound came again, definitely footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she crept to the window and peered through a gap in the curtains. The clearing appeared empty in the pale pre-dawn light, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching from the tree line. As the sun finally crested the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Margaret made herself a simple breakfast and tried to push aside her paranoia. She was jumpy, that was all. City people always imagined dangers in the wilderness. But as she sipped her coffee and planned her day, she couldn't forget those careful, measured footsteps in the darkness. The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows of the cabin, casting long shadows across the warped wooden floors. Elena had barely slept, her mind churning over the discovery in the basement and the mysterious phone calls that had plagued her throughout the night. Each time she'd drifted off, the shrill ring would pierce the silence, jolting her awake to find only static on the other end. She made her way carefully down the creaking stairs, one hand pressed protectively over her growing belly. The baby had been restless too, as if sensing her anxiety. At 6 months pregnant, every movement required deliberation, especially in this unfamiliar terrain of rotting boards and uneven surfaces. The basement looked different in daylight, streaming from a small window she hadn't noticed before. The metal box sat exactly where she'd left it, but now she could see the room more clearly. What she'd initially taken for storage clutter revealed itself as something far more organized. Shelves lined the walls, filled with manila folders, leather-bound ledgers, and what appeared to be photographic equipment from decades past. Elena approached the nearest shelf and pulled down a folder marked with a date from 1987. Inside, she found photographs of men in expensive suits standing beside mining equipment, their faces serious as they posed near what looked like the entrance to a cave or tunnel. One face made her pause, a younger version of a man she recognized from newspaper headlines, a senator who'd died in a car accident years ago. Her fingers trembled as she flipped through more images, maps with red X marks, documents bearing official government seals, and everywhere the same company logo she'd seen on the papers in the metal box, Meridian Industries. A sound from upstairs froze her in place, footsteps deliberate and heavy, moving across the cabin's main room. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized she'd left the front door unlocked. She pressed herself against the basement wall, straining to listen. "Mrs. Vasquez?" a man's voice called out, polite but with an edge that made her skin crawl. "We know you're here. We just want to talk." She heard drawers being opened, furniture moved. They were searching the place. Elena's eyes darted around the basement, looking for another way out. The small window was too high and narrow for someone in her condition. She was trapped. "We're not here to hurt you," another voice said, this one closer to the basement door. "We just need to know what old Henry might have shared with you before he passed." Elena bit back a bitter laugh. Henry hadn't shared anything with her. He'd been dead for months before she'd even known this place existed. But whoever these men were, they didn't know that. They thought she was here because of some connection to the previous owner, not because her own children had driven her away. She grabbed as many files as she could carry and stuffed them into a canvas bag she found hanging on a hook. The metal box was too heavy and conspicuous, but she managed to slip several more documents from it into the bag before she heard footsteps on the basement stairs. "Found something down here, Marcus." Elena squeezed herself behind a large wooden cabinet, her breathing shallow and quick. Through a gap between the cabinet and the wall, she watched a man in a dark suit descend into her hiding place. He was younger than his voice had suggested, with close-cropped hair and the kind of build that suggested military training. He went straight to the metal box, examining it with the familiarity of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. "Damn it," he muttered, rifling through the remaining contents. "Half of it's gone. She's been through this." "Find her," came Marcus's voice from upstairs. The man began a systematic search of the basement, moving boxes and checking behind equipment. Elena pressed herself deeper into the shadows, the baby kicking frantically as if responding to her fear. She closed her eyes and tried to calm her breathing, knowing that the slightest sound could give her away. Minutes stretched like hours until finally the man gave up and climbed back upstairs. Elena heard muffled conversation, then the front door slamming shut. She waited another 20 minutes before emerging from her hiding spot, her legs cramped and shaking. Moving to the window, she peered out to see a black sedan disappearing down the mountain road. But she knew they'd be back. Whatever Henry Morrison had stumbled onto, whatever Meridian Industries was trying to hide, she was now part of it whether she wanted to be or not. Elena clutched the bag of documents to her chest and made her way upstairs. She had to understand what she'd found before they returned, because one thing was certain: she wouldn't be running again, not this time. She'd spent too many years being pushed around by people who thought they could control her. This time, she would fight back. The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows of the cabin as Elena carefully made her way down the steep path toward the town of Cedar Falls. Her pregnancy made the trek more challenging than she'd anticipated, and she had to stop several times to catch her breath. The discovery of the gold coin had kept her awake most of the night, turning it over in her fingers, studying every detail of its intricate design. Cedar Falls was smaller than she'd remembered from her childhood visits. A handful of buildings clustered around a main street that seemed frozen in time, with weathered storefronts and pickup trucks parked at lazy angles. The mountains loomed overhead like silent sentinels, casting long shadows across the valley floor. Elena pushed open the door to Henderson's General Store, a bell chiming overhead. The elderly man behind the counter looked up from his newspaper, his weathered face creasing into a polite smile, salt and pepper beard, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He had the look of someone who'd lived in these mountains his entire life. "Morning, miss. You must be staying up at the old Morrison place." "How did you know?" Elena asked, surprised. "Not many strangers in these parts, and I saw the smoke from your chimney yesterday. I'm Bill Henderson. My family's run this store for 3 generations. He gestured around the cramped space filled with everything from canned goods to hardware supplies. "You settling in all right up there? That cabin's been empty for near 15 years. Elena nodded, pulling the gold coin from her pocket. "Actually, I was hoping you might know something about this. I found it in the cabin." Bill's expression changed the moment he saw the coin. The friendly smile faded, replaced by something Elena couldn't quite identify. Was it fear? Recognition? He picked up the coin with trembling fingers, holding it close to examine the markings. "Where exactly did you find this?" His voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, hidden behind a loose floorboard. "Why? Is it valuable?" Bill glanced toward the windows, as if checking to see if anyone was watching, then moved closer to Elena. "This isn't just valuable, miss. This here's one of the Cartwright coins." "Cartwright?" Mining family that controlled most of these mountains back in the 1880s. Ruthless bunch, from what the old stories tell. Legend has it they struck the richest vein of gold these mountains ever seen, but something went wrong, real wrong. Bill's voice grew even quieter. The whole family disappeared one winter, every last one of them. When spring came, folks found their main house burned to the ground, bodies scattered around like they'd been running from something. Elena felt a chill despite the warm morning. What does that have to do with the coin? These coins were how they marked their territory, their claims. Story goes that before they died, old Jacob Cartwright hid his fortune somewhere in these mountains, split it up, marked the locations with these special coins. Course, most folks just think it's mountain folklore. Bill handed the coin back to her with obvious reluctance. "But if you found this in the Morrison cabin, The bell above the door chimed again, and both Elena and Bill turned toward the sound. A man in an expensive suit stepped inside, looking distinctly out of place in the rustic setting. He was tall and lean, with silver hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to catalogue everything in the room in a single glance. "Mr. Henderson," the stranger said, his voice smooth and measured, "I wonder if you might help me. I'm looking for a woman who may have recently arrived in the area. Pregnant, mid-40s, driving a blue Honda Civic." Elena's blood ran cold. She'd parked her car behind the cabin, but someone could have easily spotted it. Bill's eyes flicked to her briefly before he answered. "Can't say I've seen anyone matching that description. We don't get many visitors this time of year." He placed a business card on the counter and left as abruptly as he'd arrived. Elena waited until his footsteps faded before speaking. "He's not from my family," she whispered. Bill pocketed the business card without looking at it. Figured as much. That man's got the look of someone who makes problems disappear. He leaned across the counter. "Miss, if you found what I think you found up there, you're in more danger than you know. The Cartwright fortune isn't just legend to everyone. Some folks have been searching for it for generations, and they ain't the type to share." Elena's hand instinctively moved to her growing belly. She'd come to these mountains seeking refuge, but instead she'd stumbled into something far more dangerous than her children's betrayal. The morning sun cast long shadows through the cabin's dusty windows as Margaret sat at the small wooden table, the leather journal open before her. Her coffee had grown cold as she studied the cryptic entries, trying to make sense of Uncle Theodore's increasingly frantic handwriting in the final pages. "The consortium grows suspicious," read one entry dated 3 months before his death. "They believe I've kept samples. If they knew the truth about the deposit beneath Eagle's Peak, they would stop at nothing." Margaret's hand instinctively moved to her growing belly. The baby had been restless all night, as if sensing her growing unease. She flipped through more pages, finding sketches of the cabin's layout with markings she hadn't noticed before, small X's drawn in corners and along walls. A sharp knock at the door made her jump. Through the window, she saw a black SUV parked beside her old Honda. 2 men in dark suits stood on her porch, their city shoes looking out of place on the weathered wooden boards. "Mrs. Chen?" The taller man's voice carried authority. "I'm Agent Morrison, FBI. We'd like to speak with you about your uncle's property." Margaret's heart hammered as she closed the journal and slipped it into her jacket pocket. She opened the door just wide enough to see them clearly. Morrison was mid-40s with steel-grey eyes, while his partner appeared younger, his hand resting near his jacket in a way that made her deeply uncomfortable. "What about the property?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. "We have reason to believe Theodore Chen was involved in illegal mining operations. We're conducting a routine investigation of his assets." Morrison's smile didn't reach his eyes. "May we come in? Do you have a warrant?" "We were hoping for your cooperation. Your uncle may have left behind materials relevant to our investigation." The younger agent stepped forward. "It would be easier if you helped us locate them." Margaret noticed neither had shown identification. Real FBI agents would have badges ready, wouldn't they? "I'm sorry, but I need to see proper credentials and a warrant before I can let you search the property." Morrison's pleasant facade cracked slightly. "Mrs. Chen, your uncle was involved with very dangerous people who might not be as patient as we are. For your safety and that of your unborn child, it would be wise to cooperate." The threat was thinly veiled but unmistakable. Margaret's mouth went dry. "I don't know what you're talking about." Uncle Theodore was a geologist. He collected rocks. "He collected more than rocks," the younger agent said. "Rare earth elements, specifically. Elements that certain parties would pay handsomely for and others would kill to control." Through the trees, Margaret caught sight of another vehicle approaching, a Forest Service truck. The 2 men noticed it too, their posture shifting as Ranger David Kowalski emerged and walked toward the cabin. "Morning, Margaret," David called out, his hand resting casually on his radio. "Everything all right here?" The transformation in the 2 men was immediate. Morrison stepped back, his smile returning. "Just a friendly visit with Mrs. Chen about her inheritance. We were just leaving." "Funny," David said, his eyes never leaving the men. "I don't recall seeing any federal notifications about investigations in this sector. Usually we get a heads up when the FBI operates in Forest Service territory." Morrison's jaw tightened. "This is preliminary inquiry, nothing requiring coordination yet." "I see." David's tone suggested he didn't believe a word. "Well, Mrs. Chen, I came by to check on you after yesterday's excitement. Maybe we could discuss those trail maintenance issues while these gentlemen head back to wherever they came from." The standoff lasted several tense seconds before Morrison nodded curtly. "We'll be in touch, Mrs. Chen. Please consider what we discussed." He handed her a business card. "Call me when you're ready to talk." Margaret watched the SUV disappear down the mountain road before inviting David inside. Her hands shook as she poured fresh coffee. "Those weren't FBI," David said grimly. "I've worked with federal agencies before. Wrong badges, wrong protocols, wrong everything." He studied her face. What did they really want? Margaret pulled out the journal, her decision made. "I found this in Uncle Theodore's things. I think he discovered something valuable up here, and I think it got him killed." David examined the journal, his expression growing more serious with each page. "Rare earth elements," he murmured. "There have been rumors for years about deposits in these mountains. If Theodore found a significant source—" He looked up at her. "Margaret, you could be sitting on a fortune, but you're also sitting on a target. What do I do? First, we get you somewhere safe. Then we figure out who those men really work for and what your uncle actually discovered." David closed the journal carefully. "But, Margaret, if Theodore really found what I think he found, those men will be back, and next time they might not bother with polite conversation." The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if in agreement. The first light of dawn crept through the cabin windows as Margaret sat hunched over the kitchen table, studying the photographs she'd taken of the documents. Her back ached from the uncomfortable wooden chair, but sleep had been impossible after her discovery. The baby kicked restlessly, as if sensing her agitation. She'd spent hours trying to decipher the faded handwriting and technical drawings. What emerged was a story that made her blood run cold. The papers detailed a mining operation from the 1940s, but not for gold or silver. The repeated mentions of uranium ore and government contract painted a picture of something far more valuable and dangerous. Margaret's fingers traced over a shipping manifest dated October 1943. Tons of raw uranium had been extracted from these very mountains and transported to locations with code names like Site Y and Hanford, the Manhattan Project. She'd read enough history to know what that meant. A noise outside made her freeze. Footsteps crunched on the gravel path leading to the cabin. Margaret quickly gathered the photographs and shoved them into the folder, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the window, she glimpsed a figure in a dark jacket approaching the front door. 3 sharp knocks echoed through the cabin. Margaret remained perfectly still, barely breathing. After a long moment, the footsteps moved around to the side of the building. She watched as a man peered through the kitchen window, his face obscured by shadow and a baseball cap pulled low. The door handle rattled. Margaret pressed herself against the wall, clutching the folder to her chest. The man circled the entire cabin, testing each window before his footsteps finally retreated down the path. She waited another 20 minutes before daring to look outside. An old pickup truck was disappearing around the bend in the dirt road. Margaret's hands shook as she reached for her cell phone. No service. She was completely alone up here, and someone clearly knew about her presence. The coincidence seemed impossible. She'd been here less than a week, and now mysterious visitors were prowling around, just after she'd discovered the hidden documents. She needed to get down to town, but first she had to secure the evidence. Margaret carefully placed the original documents back in the metal box, then hid it behind a loose stone in the fireplace. The photographs went into her purse along with her few essential belongings. If she had to leave quickly, she'd be ready. The drive down the mountain felt endless. Every car she passed made her grip the steering wheel tighter. In town, she parked outside the small public library and hurried inside. The elderly librarian, Mrs. Chen, looked up with a welcoming smile. "Back again so soon, dear. How are you settling in up there?" "Fine, thank you. I was wondering if you had any local history materials about mining in the area, particularly from the 1940s? Mrs. Chen's expression grew thoughtful. "Oh my, that takes me back. My father worked those mines briefly before they shut everything down. Very secretive operation it was. Government men everywhere, and then suddenly it all stopped. Father never talked much about it, except to say the work made him nervous." She led Margaret to a back corner where dusty boxes held newspaper clippings and local records. "Most of the official documents disappeared years ago, but we have some personal accounts and photographs. Help yourself, though I'm afraid it's not well organized." Margaret spent 2 hours sifting through the materials. What she found confirmed her worst fears. The uranium mining operation had been extensive, with multiple sites scattered throughout the mountain range. Workers had been sworn to secrecy, and several had reported health problems in later years. More troubling were the accounts of unexplained accidents that had befallen people who asked too many questions. A newspaper clipping from 1947 caught her attention. "Local prospector dies in suspicious fall." The article described how Tom Brennan, who'd been vocal about environmental damage from the mining, had been found dead at the bottom of Miller's Canyon. The official verdict was accidental death, but his family insisted he was too experienced a hiker to simply fall. Finding anything interesting, Mrs. Chen appeared beside her with a cup of tea. "This man, Tom Brennan. Did you know him?" "Oh yes, dear. Lovely fellow. Very concerned about the land. His death was quite a shock." Mrs. Chen lowered her voice. "Between you and me, there were always whispers that he'd found something valuable up there, something the government types didn't want him to have." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. "What kind of something? Maps, surveys, maybe stockpiled materials, who knows?" The story was that he'd hidden whatever it was somewhere safe, but it died with him. Mrs. Chen shrugged. "Probably just talk, but people around here have long memories." As Margaret drove back up the mountain, Tom Brennan's story echoed in her mind. She was beginning to understand that she'd stumbled into something much larger and more dangerous than a simple family inheritance. The question was whether she'd live long enough to figure out what to do about it. Margaret's hands trembled as she photographed every document spread across the cabin's wooden table. The pregnancy made her movements awkward, her growing belly pressing against the table edge as she leaned forward to capture each detail. The afternoon light streaming through the dusty windows provided just enough illumination to read the cramped handwriting and faded typeface. The papers told a story more shocking than she could have imagined. Her father hadn't just stumbled upon gold in these mountains. He'd been systematically documenting a massive cover-up involving the Blackstone Mining Corporation. Letters between company executives revealed they had known about toxic contamination in the groundwater for decades, deliberately hiding it from the Environmental Protection Agency and local communities. One letter, dated 15 years ago, made her blood run cold. The company had discovered that their illegal dumping had poisoned 3 separate water supplies, affecting over 2,000 residents. Instead of reporting it, they had bribed officials and falsified environmental reports. The projected cleanup costs would have bankrupted the company, so they chose silence instead. Margaret photographed a handwritten note in her father's familiar scrawl. "They offered me $2 million to disappear. Said accidents happen in these mountains. Told them I'd think about it. But I've seen what their poison did to the Morrison children. Can't live with that blood money." Her father had been a whistleblower. That's why he'd retreated to this cabin, why he'd seemed so paranoid in his final years. He hadn't been hiding from shame or failure. He'd been hiding from people who would kill to protect their secrets. A sound outside made her freeze. Footsteps crunched on gravel, slow and deliberate. Margaret quickly gathered the documents, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the window, she glimpsed a dark SUV parked behind her car, blocking the narrow road. Two men approached the cabin. The older one wore an expensive suit incongruous with the wilderness setting. The younger man moved with the predatory grace of someone accustomed to violence. Margaret recognized the older man from news articles she'd found in her father's papers, Vincent Blackstone, current CEO of Blackstone Mining. She stuffed the documents into her father's old hunting jacket and slipped toward the back door, but it was too late. The front door burst open without ceremony. Mrs. Chen Blackstone's voice carried the smooth authority of someone used to getting his way. "We need to talk." Margaret turned slowly, keeping her hands visible. "This is private property. You're trespassing. Your father's property, technically, though I imagine probate could be complicated." His smile never reached his eyes, especially if questions arose about how he acquired this land. The younger man, whose name tag read security, positioned himself between Margaret and the door. His jacket bulged tellingly at the shoulder. "What do you want?" Margaret asked, proud that her voice remained steady. "Your father was a troubled man in his final years. Paranoid delusions, conspiracy theories. I'm sure you've noticed his collection of fantasies." Blackstone gestured toward the table where she'd been working. "We're prepared to purchase this property at well above market value. Clean up whatever mess he left behind. Everyone moves on with their lives. How generous. And if I decline?" "Why would you? You're pregnant, recently estranged from your family, facing an uncertain future. This solves all your problems." He pulled out a check already made out to her, the amount obscenely large. "One signature, and you can start fresh anywhere you like." Margaret stared at the check, genuinely tempted. This money could secure her child's future, give them both the independence she'd dreamed of. But she thought of the Morrison children her father had mentioned, of the families poisoned by corporate greed. "I need time to consider." "Time is a luxury we don't have. There are others interested in this property. Mining claims, development rights. Things could get complicated quickly." The threat was unmistakable. Margaret's baby shifted inside her, as if sensing the danger. "You're asking me to pretend my father was crazy, to ignore everything he discovered. I'm asking you to be practical. Your father made powerful enemies with his accusations, people who won't be as reasonable as I'm being." Through the window, Margaret noticed movement in the trees. A third person, staying hidden but clearly positioned to prevent escape. They'd come prepared for resistance. "The documents he left behind," she said carefully. "What makes you think I haven't already copied them? Sent them somewhere safe?" Blackstone's composure cracked slightly. "Have you? What do you think?" The younger man stepped forward, but Blackstone held up a restraining hand. "You're bluffing. If you had leverage, you wouldn't be here alone." Margaret forced herself to smile. "Maybe, or maybe I'm exactly where I need to be." The standoff stretched between them, pregnant with possibility and threat. Outside, storm clouds gathered over the mountains, and Margaret realized that whatever happened next would determine not just her future, but her child's as well. The storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke as Sarah huddled in the cabin's main room, her hands trembling as she examined the contents of the metal box. Rain lashed against the windows while thunder rolled across the mountains, but the tempest outside paled in comparison to the chaos brewing in her mind. The photographs were damning. Each black and white image told a story of corruption that stretched back decades, featuring men in expensive suits shaking hands with figures she recognized from old newspaper clippings about organized crime. But it was the documents beneath the photos that made her blood run cold. Bank records, payoff schedules, names, dates, and amounts that painted a clear picture of systematic bribery reaching into the highest levels of state government. The letterhead on several documents bore the seal of the governor's office, and the signatures at the bottom belonged to men who had shaped policy for an entire generation. Sarah's baby kicked restlessly, as if sensing her distress. She pressed a hand to her belly, trying to calm both herself and the child within. "What have we stumbled into?" she whispered. A loose floorboard creaked somewhere in the cabin, and Sarah froze. The sound hadn't come from where she sat. Her heart hammered as she strained to listen above the storm. There it was again, definitely from the back of the cabin near the bedroom. Moving as quietly as her pregnant form would allow, Sarah gathered the most crucial documents and photographs, stuffing them into her jacket. She left the metal box open on the floor, hoping whoever was searching would think she'd taken everything and wouldn't look for what she'd hidden. Another creak, closer now. Sarah eased toward the front door, but the handle wouldn't turn. Someone had locked it from the outside. Panic rose in her throat as she realized she was trapped. The back door was her only option. She made her way through the narrow hallway, wincing each time a floorboard protested under her weight. Through the bedroom window, she caught a glimpse of flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. Multiple lights meant multiple people. Sarah reached the back door just as she heard the front door being forced open. The lock mechanism had been picked or broken. Heavy footsteps entered the cabin, accompanied by hushed voices she couldn't quite make out over the storm. The back door opened silently, and Sarah stepped into the driving rain. The forest behind the cabin offered her only chance of escape, but navigating the treacherous terrain in darkness while 7 months pregnant would be nearly impossible. She had no choice. The first few yards were manageable, following what seemed to be an old deer trail that led upward into the dense pine forest. But as she climbed higher, the path became increasingly treacherous. Roots and rocks created a maze of obstacles that threatened to send her tumbling with each step. Behind her, she could see flashlight beams moving through the cabin windows. They were being thorough in their search, but it wouldn't be long before they realized she wasn't inside. The thought spurred her forward, despite the burning in her legs and the stitch developing in her side. 20 minutes into her climb, Sarah heard shouts from the direction of the cabin. They'd discovered she was gone. The flashlight beams were now moving outside, sweeping the forest in systematic patterns. She pressed herself against a massive pine trunk, trying to control her labored breathing. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Sarah bit back a gasp of pain. The stress and exertion were taking their toll. She needed to find shelter soon, but the pursuers were getting closer. Their lights danced through the trees like deadly fireflies, methodically working their way up the mountainside. Sarah forced herself to keep moving, following the ridgeline where the trees provided better cover. She'd explored these mountains during her first days at the cabin and remembered seeing an old hunting blind somewhere in this direction. If she could find it, she might be able to hide until dawn. The searchers below were spreading out now, trying to cover more ground. She caught fragments of their conversations carried on the wind, professional voices discussing grid patterns and escape routes. These weren't random thugs, they were trained in manhunting. A sharp pain shot through Sarah's back, and she had to grab a tree branch to keep from falling. The baby was pressing against her spine, making each step agony. She was running out of time and strength. Then she saw it, the weathered wooden platform of the hunting blind, built into the branches of an ancient oak about 15 feet off the ground. A rope ladder hung down, swaying in the storm wind. Sarah looked back one more time. The lights were perhaps 100 yards away and closing fast. She grabbed the rope ladder and began to climb, praying that her pursuers would continue past this spot without looking up. As she hauled herself onto the platform, Sarah realized that the documents hidden in her jacket might be the key to everything. But first, she had to survive the night. The storm had passed, leaving the mountain air crisp and electric with possibility. Elena stood at the cabin window, watching morning mist rise from the forest floor like ghostly fingers, a hand instinctively resting on her growing belly. 3 weeks had elapsed since her discovery of the fortune hidden beneath the floorboards, and she'd used that time wisely, researching the stamps and coins through encrypted internet connections at the town library. What she'd learned had stolen her breath. The collection wasn't just valuable, it was legendary. The 1856 British Guiana 1-cent magenta alone was worth over $9 million. Combined with the other rarities, she was looking at a fortune that could reshape not just her life, but generations to come. Yet with each discovery came a growing unease, a sense that she was dancing on the edge of something far more dangerous than she'd initially understood. Her laptop chimed with a new email from Marcus Chen, the discreet antiquities expert she'd contacted through an encrypted service. His message was brief but chilling. Stop researching. These items have a history. People have died for less. Trust no one. Will explain when I arrive Tuesday. Elena's blood ran cold. Tuesday was today. The sound of tires crunching on gravel made her stomach lurch. Through the window she watched a sleek black sedan navigate the winding dirt road toward her cabin. This wasn't Marcus. His message had indicated he'd be driving a beat-up Honda Civic and would arrive alone. This car screamed money and menace in equal measure. She quickly closed the laptop and moved to the bedroom where she'd created a more sophisticated hiding place for the most valuable pieces. The loose floorboard had been too obvious after her initial panic. Now the true treasures were sealed in waterproof containers and buried beneath the cabin's foundation, accessible through a hidden panel she'd discovered behind the old stone fireplace. The sedan doors slammed shut with expensive finality. Two figures emerged, a woman in an immaculate charcoal suit despite the wilderness setting, and a man whose military bearing was unmistakable even from a distance. They moved with predatory efficiency toward her front door. Elena grabbed her cell phone, but the display showed no signal bars. The storm had damaged the local tower, leaving her effectively cut off from the outside world. Her nearest neighbor was 5 miles away through dense forest, and her pregnancy made any thought of running through rough terrain impossible. The knock came, 3 measured raps that somehow managed to sound both polite and threatening. "Ms. Vasquez?" The woman's voice carried authority and barely concealed impatience. "We'd like to speak with you about some items that may have come into your possession." Elena's mind raced. How could they know? She'd been so careful, using public computers, encrypted communications, false names, unless— "I think you have the wrong person," Elena called through the door, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "Please don't make this more difficult than necessary. We know about the collection. We know you've been researching it. We're prepared to make you a very generous offer." The words hung in the air like a threat wrapped in silk. Elena peered through the window again and saw the man circling toward the cabin's rear exit. They'd come prepared for resistance. "Collection?" she asked, buying time while she tried to formulate a plan. "I'm just a pregnant woman living quietly in the mountains." "Ms. Vasquez, the items you found belong to some very important people who've been looking for them for a very long time. We can do this the easy way, with everyone walking away wealthy and happy, or we can do this the hard way. The choice is yours." Elena's hand moved protectively over her belly. Whatever these people wanted, whatever they were willing to do, she had to think about more than just herself now. But she also couldn't simply hand over a fortune that represented her child's entire future. A new sound reached her ears, another vehicle approaching, this one with a laboring engine that matched Marcus Chen's description of his Honda. Through the trees she could see the faded blue car making its careful way up the mountain road. The woman at her door heard it too. "You were expecting someone, Miss Vasquez?" "My doctor," Elena lied smoothly. "I have complications with my pregnancy. He makes house calls." She heard muffled conversation outside, then footsteps moving away from the door. From her vantage point, she watched the woman stride toward the approaching Honda, her companion materializing from the forest to flank the vehicle. Marcus Chen's car came to an abrupt stop 50 yards from the cabin. Even from this distance, Elena could see his hands raised in a gesture of surrender as the two figures approached his vehicle. Whatever conversation ensued was brief and intense, ending with Marcus being escorted toward the cabin between his two captors. Elena realized with crystalline clarity that the game had fundamentally changed. This was no longer about money or even treasure. This was about survival, hers and her unborn child's. The headlights cut through the mountain darkness like twin knives, as Margaret gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white against the worn leather. Every bump in the winding road sent sharp pains through her swollen belly, but she couldn't slow down. Not now. Not when Vincent Crane's men could be anywhere in these hills. Behind her, the cabin grew smaller in the rearview mirror, swallowed by the forest that had sheltered her for weeks. She'd left everything behind except the leather journal, the metal case with its mysterious contents, and the growing certainty that her grandfather's death hadn't been an accident. The radio crackled with static as she descended the mountain, searching for a signal. Finally, a news station broke through the interference, and Margaret's blood ran cold at the lead story. Local businessman Vincent Crane announced today that his development company has acquired mineral rights to over 3,000 acres in the Blackwood Mountain region. The controversial purchase has environmental groups concerned about the impact on the watershed. Margaret switched off the radio, her mind racing. Mineral rights. That explained everything. Why Crane wanted the land, why her grandfather had been killed, why she was now being hunted. The old man had discovered something valuable in those mountains, something worth killing for. Her phone buzzed against the passenger seat. A text from an unknown number made her heart skip. "Stop running, Mrs. Chen. We only want to talk." She tossed the phone aside and pressed harder on the accelerator. The mountain road twisted dangerously, but she knew these paths from childhood summers. Her grandfather had taught her every curve, every shortcut. If Crane's men were following her, they wouldn't have that advantage. 20 minutes later, she pulled into the parking lot of Millfield General Hospital, the same place where she'd given birth to David and Sarah decades ago. The irony wasn't lost on her, seeking refuge in a place that held memories of when her children actually needed her. Dr. Rebecca Marsh was just finishing her rounds when Margaret approached the nurse's station, breathless and clutching her side. "I need help," Margaret whispered, glancing nervously at the entrance. "But not the kind you think." Dr. Marsh, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair, led Margaret to a private office. "You look terrified. What's going on?" Margaret hesitated, then pulled out the leather journal. "My grandfather died 3 months ago. Everyone said it was natural causes, but I found this hidden in his cabin. I think he was murdered." As Dr. Marsh examined the journal's geological notes and sketches, her expression grew increasingly serious. "These mineral surveys, Margaret, do you understand what this represents? Valuable enough to kill for? Valuable enough to start wars over." Dr. Marsh closed the journal carefully. "Rare earth elements, the kind used in every smartphone, electric car battery, and military guidance system. If your grandfather found a deposit in these mountains, Vincent Crane would do anything to get his hands on it." Margaret finished the thought, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "He's been buying up land for months, pushing people out. My grandfather must have refused to sell." Dr. Marsh walked to the window, peering out at the parking lot. "There's a black SUV that's been circling the hospital since you arrived." "Friends of yours?" Margaret's stomach dropped. "We need to call the police." "With what proof? A journal full of geological surveys?" Dr. Marsh shook her head. "Crane owns half this county, including the sheriff's department. We need something more concrete." Margaret opened the metal case, revealing the rock samples her grandfather had collected. Under the office's fluorescent lights, the stones seemed to shimmer with an inner fire, their surfaces streaked with veins of metallic color. "These came from somewhere on his property," Margaret said. "If we can find the source, we'll have evidence of what Crane is really after." Dr. Marsh picked up one of the samples, weighing it in her palm. "I have a friend at the State Geological Survey. If these test positive for rare earth elements, it could trigger a federal investigation." Outside, car doors slammed. Through the window, Margaret watched 3 men in dark suits enter the hospital's main entrance. Her heart hammered against her ribs as recognition hit her, the same faces from the cabin security footage. "Back exit?" she asked urgently. Dr. Marsh was already moving, gathering the journal and samples. "This way. My car's in the employee lot." They slipped through the hospital's maze-like corridors, past sleeping patients and skeleton crew staff. Behind them, Margaret could hear voices at the nurses' station, asking questions about a pregnant woman who'd come in seeking help. The cold mountain air hit them like a slap as they emerged into the employee parking area. Dr. Marsh's sedan sat under a flickering streetlight, and Margaret had never been so grateful to see an escape route. But as they approached the car, a figure stepped out from behind a van, blocking their path. Vincent Crane himself, impeccably dressed despite the late hour, his smile as cold as the mountain wind. "Mrs. Chen," he said pleasantly, "I believe you have something that belongs to me." The wind howled through the pine trees as Sarah pressed herself against the cold stone wall of the cave entrance, her heart hammering against her ribs. The beam of a flashlight swept across the rocky ground just 20 feet away, and she could hear boots crunching on the frost-covered leaves. "She's got to be here somewhere," a gruff voice called out. "The tracks lead right to this area." Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her belly, protecting the life growing within her. The baby seemed to sense her fear, shifting restlessly as if responding to the adrenaline coursing through her system. She had to stay calm, had to think clearly. The gold bars hidden deeper in the cave behind her represented more than just wealth. They were her child's future, their chance at a life free from the cruelty she'd endured. Another voice, younger and more nervous, joined the first. "Maybe she went back down the mountain. It's pretty rough terrain up here for someone in her condition." "Thompson doesn't pay us to make assumptions," the gruff voice replied. "We search every inch until we find her and whatever she discovered in that cabin." Sarah's blood ran cold at the mention of Thompson's name. She'd heard that name whispered in fearful tones by the elderly woman at the general store, but she'd been too focused on gathering supplies to pay much attention. Now she understood. Marcus Thompson wasn't just some local businessman. He was someone with enough power and ruthlessness to send armed men after a pregnant woman in the wilderness. The flashlight beam moved closer, and Sarah retreated deeper into the cave, feeling her way along the rough limestone walls. Her fingers touched the familiar shape of one of the gold bars, and she remembered the journal entry she'd found tucked beneath them. The shaky handwriting of the previous cabin owner had revealed the truth about the mountain's dark history, how Thompson's grandfather had used forced labor to extract gold from these very caves, how workers had died and been buried in unmarked graves, how the family had built their empire on blood and suffering. The gold she'd found wasn't just hidden treasure, it was evidence of crimes that could bring down one of the most powerful families in the state, if it ever saw the light of day. "Check that cave opening," the gruff voice commanded. Sarah's breath caught as heavy footsteps approached. She pressed herself against a natural alcove in the cave wall, praying the shadows would conceal her. The baby kicked, and she bit her lip to suppress a gasp of pain. A flashlight beam penetrated the cave entrance, sweeping back and forth across the rocky floor. Sarah held her breath as the light passed just inches from her hiding spot, illuminating the rough stone wall beside her face. "Anything?" the younger voice called from outside. "Too shallow to hide much," came the reply, "but there are some strange markings on the walls. Looks like old mining activity." Sarah's heart sank as she realized they were getting too close to the truth. If they discovered the cave's connection to the historical mining operations, they'd tear apart every inch until they found the gold. "We need to call this in," the nervous voice said. "If there's mining evidence up here, Thompson's going to want to know about it personally." "Not until we find the woman," the first man replied firmly. He was very clear about that priority. The voices began to fade as the men moved away from the cave entrance, but Sarah knew this was only temporary. They'd be back with more people, more equipment, and probably dogs to track her scent. She had maybe an hour before this temporary sanctuary became a trap. Moving carefully in the darkness, she felt her way to where she'd hidden her backpack among the gold bars. Inside, along with the few supplies she'd managed to grab during her hasty escape from the cabin, was the journal that documented everything. Names, dates, locations of burial sites, financial records written in the careful script of someone who knew they were documenting crimes. The author of the journal had been Thompson's own grandfather's bookkeeper, a man whose conscience had finally overcome his fear. He'd stolen a portion of the gold and fled to the mountain cabin, but apparently he'd never found the courage to expose the truth before his death. Now that burden fell to Sarah, but first she had to survive long enough to get the evidence to someone who could act on it. She stuffed several of the smaller gold bars into her backpack, along with the journal. The weight was almost more than she could bear, but she forced herself to stand. Her child deserved better than a world where powerful men could crush the innocent without consequence. The baby kicked again, stronger this time, and Sarah took it as encouragement. She was fighting for 2 lives now, and she wouldn't give up easily. Moving toward the back of the cave, she remembered seeing another passage during her earlier exploration. It might lead nowhere, but it was better than waiting here for Thompson's men to return. The storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke as Margaret crouched behind the fallen oak tree, her heart hammering against her ribs. Rain pelted the forest floor around her, turning the autumn leaves into a slippery carpet beneath her feet. Through the darkness, she could see the beam of flashlights sweeping across the cabin's windows, their harsh white glare cutting through the night like accusatory fingers. She pressed her hand to her swollen belly, feeling the baby shift restlessly inside her. The little one seemed to sense the danger too, responding to her elevated pulse and shallow breathing with anxious movements that made her wince. She had to stay calm, had to think clearly despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm her. The voices carried on the wind were clearer now, close enough that she could make out individual words. Thomas Whitmore's cultured accent was unmistakable, even when raised in anger. She knows too much. The photographs, the documents, if any of that surfaces, were all finished. Then we clean it up, came another voice, rougher, more working class. Margaret recognized it as belonging to the man who had been watching her from the tree line for the past 3 days. Make it look like an accident. Pregnant woman alone in the mountains, anything could happen. Margaret bit down hard on her knuckle to keep from crying out. The precious bundle she had retrieved from the hidden compartment was still clutched in her other hand. The photographs that proved what really happened to the Henderson mining operation 40 years ago, and more importantly, who had orchestrated the cover-up that had destroyed so many lives. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the scene in stark black and white. She counted 4 figures moving around the cabin now, their coordination suggesting military or law enforcement training. These weren't just corporate executives trying to protect their reputations, these were professionals. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if protesting the cramped position. Margaret shifted carefully, trying to find a more comfortable angle while staying hidden. The movement caused her foot to slip on the wet leaves, sending a small cascade of debris down the slope. She froze, holding her breath. One of the flashlight beams swung in her direction, the circle of light dancing just inches from her hiding spot. She pressed herself deeper into the hollow beneath the fallen tree, feeling bark scrape against her back. The musty smell of rotting wood and damp earth filled her nostrils. What was that? The rough voice again, alert and suspicious. Probably just a raccoon or something, Whitmore replied. But she could hear the tension beneath his dismissive tone. Check it anyway. Footsteps approached her position, deliberate and careful. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to make herself invisible, thinking of the baby and what would happen if they were caught. She had already lost so much. Her home, her relationship with her children, her sense of security. But this new life growing inside her represented hope, a chance to start over. She wouldn't let them take that away. The footsteps stopped, just above her hiding place. Through the gap in the fallen branches, she could see black tactical boots, water streaming off their polished surface. The man was so close she could hear his breathing, see the red dot of what might have been a cigarette or electronic device. Nothing here, he called back after what felt like an eternity. As the footsteps retreated, Margaret allowed herself to breathe again. But her relief was short-lived. From the cabin came the sound of splintering wood. They had forced their way inside. Soon they would discover that she wasn't there, and their search would expand to the surrounding forest. She needed to move, but where? The main trail back to town would be too obvious, and her condition made it impossible to attempt the more treacherous mountain paths in darkness and rain. Then she remembered something old Henry had mentioned during one of his rambling stories about the cabin's history, an abandoned mine shaft about half a mile north, hidden behind a screen of young pine trees. It wasn't ideal, but it would provide shelter and concealment until morning, and if what she suspected about the documents in her hand was true, that mine might hold more answers about the conspiracy she had stumbled into. Margaret began to move, staying low and using the storm's noise to mask her retreat. Each step was a calculated risk, each pause a chance for discovery. Behind her, the lights in the cabin blazed as her pursuers ransacked her temporary home, searching for the evidence that was now safely tucked inside her jacket. The baby seemed calmer now that they were moving, as if understanding that motion meant survival. Margaret whispered a silent promise as she made her way through the darkness. She would protect this child, would uncover the truth, and would make sure those responsible finally faced justice. But first, she had to survive the night. The storm that had been brewing all afternoon finally unleashed its fury as Elena pressed herself against the rough bark of an ancient pine tree. Lightning illuminated the forest in stark, terrifying snapshots, revealing the three men moving methodically through the undergrowth below her hiding spot. They carried flashlights that swept the darkness like predatory eyes, searching. Her heart hammered against her ribs so violently she feared they might hear it over the thunder. The canvas bag containing the journals and photographs felt impossibly heavy across her shoulder, weighted with secrets that had already cost too many lives. Rain soaked through her jacket, chilling her to the bone, but she didn't dare move. "She can't have gone far," one of the men called out, his voice carrying on the wind, "not in her condition." Elena's hand instinctively moved to her belly. The baby had been unusually active tonight, as if sensing her fear. She closed her eyes and tried to control her breathing, remembering what Marcus had taught her about staying calm under pressure. But Marcus was gone now, his blood still staining her memory, and she was utterly alone. The beam of a flashlight swept dangerously close to her position. She could see the lead man now, tall, wearing expensive outdoor gear that seemed wildly out of place in these remote mountains. His face was sharp, predatory, and she recognized him from one of the old photographs she'd found in her father's hidden safe. Decades older now, but unmistakably the same man who had stood beside her father at that mining operation all those years ago. Thunder crashed overhead, masking the sound of her careful movement as she edged around the tree trunk. The path Marcus had shown her 2 days ago lay just ahead, a narrow deer trail that wound up toward the old mining tunnels. If she could reach it without being seen, she might have a chance. But as she took her first step, a branch snapped under her weight. All 3 flashlights swung toward the sound immediately. Elena abandoned stealth and ran, crashing through the underbrush as shouts erupted behind her. Branches tore at her clothes and face, but she pushed forward, driven by pure terror and the fierce protective instinct that had awakened within her since learning about the baby. The trail was steeper than she remembered, and her pregnancy made every step more labored than it should have been. Behind her, the pursuit was gaining ground. These men were professionals, moving with the calculated efficiency of those accustomed to hunting human prey. She stumbled and fell hard, crying out as pain shot through her knee. The bag flew from her shoulder, spilling its contents across the muddy path. Photographs scattered in the wind like accusations, while her father's leather journal landed spine up in a growing puddle. There! The voice was much closer now. Elena scrambled to gather the scattered evidence, her hands shaking as she stuffed papers back into the bag. But there wasn't time to find everything. She could see the bouncing lights of their flashlights through the trees, perhaps 50 yards away and closing fast. The tunnel entrance loomed ahead, a black mouth in the mountainside that promised either salvation or a tomb. Elena had explored it briefly with Marcus, but they hadn't gone deep. Now, with no other choice, she plunged into the darkness. The temperature dropped immediately, and the sounds of the storm faded to a distant rumble. Her footsteps echoed strangely in the narrow passage, and she fumbled for the small LED flashlight Marcus had insisted she carry. Its weak beam revealed rough-hewn walls and timber supports that looked disturbingly old and unreliable. Behind her, she heard voices at the tunnel mouth arguing. They were hesitant to follow her into the unknown darkness, buying her precious time. But she knew they would come eventually. Men like these didn't give up easily, especially when the stakes were this high. The tunnel branched ahead, and Elena chose the left passage on pure instinct. The journal had mentioned multiple levels to this mining operation, with some shafts going deeper than others. If she could find one of the lower levels, perhaps she could hide until dawn, when search and rescue teams might arrive to investigate the gunshots that had echoed through the valley earlier. The thought of Marcus's death threatened to overwhelm her again, but she pushed it aside. Grief was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. The baby needed her to survive, and the truth her father had died protecting needed to see daylight. A new sound echoed from behind her, footsteps in the tunnel. They had made their decision. Elena quickened her pace, following the twisting passage deeper into the mountain's heart. The air grew thicker and more stagnant with each step, carrying the metallic scent of old ore and something else, something that made her stomach turn. Then her flashlight beam caught something that made her freeze completely. Ahead, blocking the passage, lay what remained of a human skeleton, still wearing the tattered remnants of mining clothes. And carved into the wall above it, in her father's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "They're coming. Trust no one." The helicopter's rotors cut through the mountain air like a death knell, growing louder with each passing second. Elena pressed herself against the cold stone wall of the mine shaft, her heart hammering against her ribs. The baby kicked frantically, as if sensing the danger that surrounded them. Marcus grabbed her arm, his weathered face etched with urgency. "There's another way out," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the approaching aircraft. "But it's dangerous. More dangerous than staying here?" Elena's breath came in short gasps as she watched dust motes dance in the shaft of sunlight streaming through the mine entrance. Without answering, Marcus led her deeper into the tunnels, away from the main passage. The sound of boots on gravel echoed from the entrance behind them. Their pursuers had arrived. Elena bit back a cry as another contraction seized her, stronger than before. The baby was coming, whether she was ready or not. The narrow tunnel Marcus chose seemed to close in around them as they moved. Ancient timber supports creaked ominously overhead, and Elena could feel the weight of the mountain pressing down. Her fingers traced along the rough wall for guidance as the light from Marcus's flashlight bobbed ahead. "The old mining families knew these mountains better than anyone," Marcus panted as they climbed through a particularly tight passage. "They built escape routes for cave-ins, but also for other emergencies. The government men who came looking for the uranium deposits back in the 50s, they weren't the first to want what's hidden here." Elena's mind reeled as pieces of the puzzle clicked together. "The documents we found, they weren't just about mining rights, were they?" "No." Marcus paused at a junction where 3 tunnels converged. "Your cabin sits on what used to be the Blackwood family claim. They found something in 1952 that scared them enough to hide it and disappear. The uranium was just the cover story." A distant shout echoed through the tunnels behind them. Their pursuers had entered the mine. Marcus chose the left tunnel, and Elena noticed it sloped upward more steeply. Her legs burned with the effort of climbing while dealing with increasingly frequent contractions. She gripped the leather satchel containing the documents tighter, knowing that whatever secrets it held had already cost lives. "My grandmother used to tell stories," Marcus continued as they climbed, "about lights in the sky over these mountains, about men in black cars asking questions no one could answer. We thought they were just stories until the government started buying up land through shell companies." The tunnel suddenly opened into a vast cavern, and Elena gasped. The beam of Marcus's flashlight revealed walls that seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly quality. Strange symbols were carved into the rock face, symbols that didn't match any Native American petroglyphs she'd ever seen. "What is this place?" she whispered. Before Marcus could answer, Elena doubled over as the strongest contraction yet seized her. Warm fluid rushed down her legs, and she knew with absolute certainty that her labor had progressed beyond the point of no return. "The baby's coming now," she gasped, sinking to her knees on the cavern floor. Marcus's face went pale in the flashlight's glow. "Elena, we can't stop here. Listen." The sound of voices grew closer. Their pursuers had found the right tunnel. "I can't make it any farther," Elena said through gritted teeth. "Whatever's going to happen, it's happening here." Marcus set down his pack and pulled out a worn map. "There's a ranger station about 2 miles north if we can reach the surface. This cavern has an opening that connects to the old Blackwood cabin foundation." As if summoned by his words, a new source of light appeared from above. Elena looked up to see a natural chimney in the cavern ceiling, with afternoon sunlight filtering down through hanging roots and vegetation. "The rope," Marcus said, pointing to climbing gear in his pack. "I can get you up there, but—" "I'm not leaving without those documents," Elena interrupted, another contraction making her voice sharp. "Whatever the Blackwood family found, whatever the government's been covering up, it's connected to my baby's future now. I won't let my child inherit another generation of lies." The voices in the tunnel were close enough now that they could make out individual words. Something about securing the area and eliminating witnesses. Marcus's jaw tightened with resolve. "Then we go up together, and we finish this." As he secured the rope and prepared the climbing harness, Elena stared at the strange symbols on the cavern walls. In the shifting light, they almost seemed to move, to pulse with their own inner rhythm. She placed a protective hand over her belly, feeling the baby's movements synchronize with the strange energy that seemed to emanate from the very walls around them. Whatever secrets lay buried in these mountains, her child would be born knowing the truth. The helicopter's rotors cut through the mountain air as Elena pressed herself against the cold stone wall of the cave entrance, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the narrow opening, she could see the aircraft hovering just beyond the tree line, its searchlight sweeping across the forest floor like a predatory eye. Marcus pulled her deeper into the shadows, his hand firm on her shoulder. "They're not going away," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the mechanical thunder above. Elena's mind raced. The pendant felt heavy against her chest, its weight seeming to increase with each passing moment. 3 generations of her family had died protecting this secret, and now she understood why. The consortium wasn't just after money, they were after something that could reshape the balance of power across continents. "There's another way out," she said, remembering the crude map she'd found in her grandmother's journal. "My grandmother wrote about a passage that leads to the old mining tunnels." Marcus looked skeptical. "Elena, those tunnels have been abandoned for decades. Half of them have probably collapsed. It's better than waiting here for them to find us." She placed a protective hand over her growing belly. "I won't let them hurt my baby." The helicopter's engine grew louder, and Elena could hear voices calling out commands. They were landing. Time was running out. She led Marcus deeper into the cave system, using her phone's flashlight to navigate the treacherous path. The air grew thicker as they descended, heavy with the scent of earth and time. Water dripped steadily from somewhere in the darkness, creating an eerie percussion that masked their footsteps. "Here," Elena said, stopping before a narrow fissure in the rock wall. It was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, and the darkness beyond seemed absolute. Marcus examined the opening with his light. "Are you sure about this?" Before Elena could answer, the sound of boots on stone echoed from the cave entrance behind them. Flashlight beams danced across the walls, growing brighter with each passing second. "Move," Elena hissed, pushing through the fissure. The passage was a nightmare of sharp edges and suffocating darkness. Elena's coat caught on jagged rocks, and more than once she had to stop to catch her breath. Behind her, Marcus struggled to keep up, his broader frame making the journey even more difficult. After what felt like an eternity, the passage opened into a larger tunnel. The walls here were different, reinforced with old wooden beams and metal tracks running along the floor. They had reached the mining system. Elena paused to orient herself, consulting her grandmother's journal by flashlight. The faded ink described a network of tunnels that connected to an exit near the old logging road, miles from where the consortium was searching. "This way," she said, turning left down the main tunnel. They moved quickly but carefully, aware that one wrong step could send them plummeting into an abandoned shaft. The temperature was dropping, and Elena could see her breath misting in the cold air. "Elena," Marcus said suddenly, grabbing her arm. "Listen." She stopped, straining her ears. At first she heard only the sound of their breathing and the distant drip of water. Then she caught it, voices echoing from somewhere behind them in the tunnel system. "How did they—" she began. "Local guides," Marcus said grimly. "The consortium has resources we can't match. They probably have maps of every tunnel in this mountain." Elena felt a surge of desperation. She thought of her children, who had cast her out when she needed them most, and of the unborn child who depended on her now. The pendant's secret had already claimed too many lives. She wouldn't let it claim hers. "There's something I haven't told you," she said, making a decision that terrified her. "The pendant isn't just a key to finding the treasure. According to my grandmother's journal, it's the only thing keeping the consortium from accessing something much more dangerous." Marcus stared at her in the pale glow of their flashlights. "What are you talking about?" "The gold and artifacts were never the real treasure," Elena said, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "They were a cover story. What's really hidden up here is information, documents that expose illegal operations spanning decades, military contracts, government corruption, human trafficking routes. My grandfather wasn't just a war hero who found Nazi gold. He was an intelligence operative who discovered something that could bring down some of the most powerful people in the world." The voices behind them were getting closer, and Elena could see flashlight beams beginning to penetrate the darkness of the tunnel. "That's why they'll never stop hunting us," she continued. "As long as this pendant exists, as long as someone knows the truth, they're vulnerable." Marcus absorbed this information, his expression grave. "So what do we do?" Elena looked down at the pendant one more time, thinking of her grandmother's final words about the terrible price of keeping secrets. Then she looked ahead into the darkness of the tunnel, toward whatever freedom might await them beyond. "We survive this first," she said. "Then we make sure the whole world knows the truth." The helicopter's rotors sliced through the dawn air as Elena pressed herself against the cabin's stone foundation, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the kitchen window, she could see Marcus frantically stuffing documents into a leather satchel while barking orders into his phone. "I don't care what it takes," his voice carried through the thin glass. "Find her before she reaches civilization. The woman knows too much." Elena's hand instinctively moved to her swollen belly, feeling the baby shift restlessly inside her. She had maybe minutes before Marcus's men would begin their sweep of the property. The evidence she'd photographed with Samuel's old camera could expose decades of corruption, but only if she lived long enough to share it. The helicopter touched down in the clearing where she'd once found peace among the wildflowers. Now those same flowers bent under the violent downdraft as armed men emerged from the aircraft. Elena recognized the lead figure's military bearing. This wasn't some corporate security team. These were professionals. She slipped around the cabin's corner, keeping low as her pregnancy allowed. The root cellar where she'd first discovered Samuel's hidden chamber beckoned from across 20 yards of open ground. Inside that underground space lay her only advantage, Samuel's detailed journals documenting every transaction, every buried account, every life Marcus had destroyed building his empire. A branch snapped behind her. Elena spun to find Marcus himself approaching, his expensive suit incongruous in the wilderness setting. His face wore the same cold mask she remembered from their first meeting, but his eyes held something new. Desperation. "Mrs. Chen," he said softly, raising his hands in a gesture of false peace. "There's no need for this to end badly. You're carrying a child. Think about what's best for your baby." "I am thinking about my baby," Elena replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm thinking about the world I want to leave behind." Marcus smiled. but it didn't reach his eyes. "The documents you've seen, you don't understand their context. Samuel was involved in things that would destroy innocent people if exposed. I've been protecting his legacy, protecting you." "Protecting yourself, you mean?" Elena began backing toward the cellar, each step calculated. "Samuel's journals tell a different story. They tell the truth about what you've been doing with those mining rights, those shell companies, how many families lost their homes so you could expand your operation." The mask slipped from Marcus's face. Samuel was a foolish old man who never understood the bigger picture. He thought small, lived small. I turned his discoveries into an empire worth billions, built on theft and murder. "Built on progress." Marcus's voice rose, then he caught himself, glancing toward his men who were systematically searching the cabin's perimeter. "You can't understand the complexities of modern business. Sometimes difficult decisions must be made for the greater good." Elena's heel touched the cellar's wooden door. "Almost there." "Whose greater good? Yours?" A sharp pain lanced through her abdomen, and she gasped, doubling over. The baby, something was wrong. The stress, the fear, the physical demands of the past few days had pushed her body beyond its limits. Marcus stepped closer, his expression shifting to predatory satisfaction. "You see, this is what happens when pregnant women involve themselves in matters beyond their comprehension. Let me help you. Let me get you to a hospital." Through the pain, Elena saw the trap. Once she was in Marcus's custody, isolated in some private medical facility, she would simply disappear. Another unfortunate casualty, another loose end tied off cleanly. She forced herself upright, fighting through another contraction. The photos are already uploaded. Cloud storage, multiple servers. If anything happens to me, you're lying. But uncertainty flickered in Marcus's voice. "Samuel taught me more than you know. He was paranoid about digital security, showed me how to hide things where they could never be erased." Elena's hand found the cellar door's handle behind her back. "Timer-activated releases. If I don't check in every 12 hours? Marcus lunged forward, but Elena had already yanked the cellar door open and rolled inside, slamming it shut above her. The wooden beam that served as a locking mechanism slid into place just as Marcus's fists began pounding against the door. In the darkness below, Elena crawled toward Samuel's hidden chamber, following the path her hands had memorized. Another contraction seized her, stronger this time, and she realized with terrifying clarity that her baby was coming whether she was ready or not. Above her, Marcus's shouting grew more frantic as he called for tools to break through the reinforced door. But Elena knew something he didn't. Samuel's paranoia had extended to multiple escape routes. The chamber connected to an old mine shaft that emerged half a mile down the mountain. As her labor intensified in the underground darkness, Elena reached for the emergency radio Samuel had hidden among his supplies. She had one chance to contact the outside world before Marcus's men found another way in. The helicopter's rotors thundered overhead as Elena pressed herself against the cold stone wall of the mine entrance, her heart hammering against her ribs. The baby kicked restlessly, as if sensing the danger that surrounded them. Marcus gripped her hand tightly, his knuckles white in the dim light filtering through the cave opening. "They're landing," he whispered, peering around the rocky outcropping. 3 men, maybe 4. Elena closed her eyes, trying to think through the pain that shot through her lower back. The contractions had been coming irregularly for the past hour, but she couldn't tell Marcus, not now, when their lives hung in the balance. The sound of boots crunching on gravel echoed from outside. Heavy, deliberate steps that spoke of military training and deadly intent. Elena recognized the voice that cut through the mountain air like a blade. "Mrs. Castellanos, we know you're in there." Senator Morrison's tone was cultured, almost polite, but the underlying menace was unmistakable. "You've caused us considerable trouble." Marcus moved protectively in front of Elena, though they both knew his hunting rifle would be little match for whatever firepower Morrison had brought. The cave stretched deep into the mountain behind them, but Elena knew from her weeks of exploration that it eventually dead-ended at an underground pool. "What you've discovered," Morrison continued, his voice growing closer, "belongs to people far more powerful than you can imagine. The Blackwood Mining Consortium has operated in these mountains for over a century. We've built fortunes, funded campaigns, shaped the very fabric of this nation." Elena felt another contraction grip her abdomen and bit down hard on her lower lip to keep from crying out. The timing couldn't be worse. She thought of the documents hidden in the cabin's false floor, evidence of illegal mining operations, environmental cover-ups, and the systematic poisoning of water supplies that had killed dozens in the valleys below. "My children," she whispered to Marcus, the words barely audible. "They need to know the truth about what I found." Marcus shook his head firmly. "Don't talk like that. We're getting out of here." But Elena could see the doubt in his eyes. They both knew the odds. Footsteps entered the mine shaft, accompanied by the harsh beam of military-grade flashlights. Elena counted at least 3 sets of boots on the rocky floor, moving with practiced coordination. "The beauty of remote locations," Morrison's voice echoed off the cave walls, "is that accidents happen so easily. Cave-ins, for instance, tragically common in these old mining operations." Elena's mind raced. The mine had multiple chambers, connected by narrow passages that larger men might struggle to navigate. If she could reach the deeper sections, maybe find another way out. Another contraction hit, stronger this time, and Elena couldn't suppress a small gasp. Marcus's eyes widened in understanding and horror. "Now," he mouthed silently. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. The baby was coming, whether they were safe or not. The flashlight beams swept closer, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Elena could see Morrison now, his silver hair immaculate despite the mountain wind, flanked by 2 men in tactical gear. A third figure lingered near the entrance, someone smaller, familiar. Elena's blood ran cold as she recognized her son, David, his face pale but determined. "Mother," David called out, his voice cracking slightly, "please, just give them what they want. The documents, the samples, everything. They've promised they'll let us all walk away." The betrayal cut deeper than any physical pain. Her own son, leading these men to her like a hunting dog. Elena remembered the phone call David had made that morning, supposedly to check on her welfare. He'd been reporting her location. "David," she whispered, loud enough for her voice to carry, "do you know what they've done? What these people are responsible for?" "I know they're offering us enough money to solve all our problems," David replied, stepping closer. "Enough to secure the baby's future, to pay off our debts, to start over." Marcus raised his rifle, not at Morrison or his men, but toward David. "Stay back." Morrison chuckled. "Such loyalty, Marcus. Admirable but futile. You see, we've had contingencies in place from the moment Elena discovered our operations. David has been quite helpful in that regard." Elena felt the walls of the mine closing in around her, not just physically but emotionally. The son she'd carried and raised, who she'd sacrificed everything for, had sold her out for money. The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. She'd been cast out for being a burden, only to become a target for the very fortune that could have saved them all. But as another contraction gripped her, Elena felt something else stirring within her, not just new life but a fierce determination. This child would not be born into a world poisoned by greed and corruption, not if she could help it. She squeezed Marcus's hand and whispered urgently, "The back chamber. There's something I never showed you." The morning sun cast long shadows across the mountain meadow as Elena stood at the edge of the cliff, her newborn daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms. Below, the FBI vehicles looked like toy cars scattered across the valley floor, their red and blue lights still flashing in the early dawn. Agent Martinez had kept his word. The Blackstone Corporation executives were already in custody, their decades-long conspiracy finally exposed. Elena's phone buzzed with another text from Michael. Her eldest son had been calling and messaging constantly since the news broke about the treasure and the arrests. The irony wasn't lost on her. The children who had cast her out for her foolish pregnancy were now desperately trying to reconnect, no doubt motivated by the fortune she'd discovered in the cabin walls. She deleted the message without reading it. "Mrs. Vasquez?" Agent Martinez approached carefully, his footsteps crunching on the frost-covered grass. "The forensics team has finished documenting everything. The gold coins, the documents, the safety deposit box keys, it's all catalogued and ready for the legal proceedings." Elena nodded, adjusting the blanket around baby Sophia. The child had been born during the most terrifying night of her life, arriving just hours before the Blackstone mercenaries had found the cabin. Yet somehow, through all the chaos and violence, Sophia had remained calm, as if she understood that her mother needed her to be strong. "What happens now?" Elena asked. "The treasure legally belongs to you, given that you inherited the cabin from your aunt," Martinez explained. "Old Henrik's descendants were wiped out in the war, and the statute of limitations has long expired on any other claims. The courts will sort out the details, but you're looking at a substantial inheritance. The preliminary assessment suggests it's worth over $20 million. Elena felt a strange numbness at the figure. 6 months ago, such wealth would have seemed like an impossible dream. Now, having nearly lost her life and her daughter defending it, the money felt almost secondary to what she'd truly gained, her independence and self-worth. "There's something else," Martinez continued, pulling out a weathered leather journal. "We found this hidden with the last cache of coins. It's Henrik Larsson's diary, documenting his escape from Norway and his time in these mountains. He wrote about a woman who helped him, who showed him kindness when he had nothing. Her name was Elena." Elena's breath caught. "That's impossible. The timing—" "Your great-grandmother, according to our research. Henrik never forgot her kindness. The letter we found with the diary, he left the treasure specifically for her bloodline, hoping someday Elena would find it and understand its true value." Tears blurred Elena's vision as she thought of her great-grandmother, a woman she'd only known through faded photographs and half-remembered stories. The connection across generations, the kindness that had rippled through decades to reach her in her darkest hour. It felt like destiny rather than coincidence. A black SUV wound its way up the mountain road, and Elena's stomach tightened. Through the windshield, she could make out the familiar silhouettes of Michael and Rebecca. They'd come, just as she'd known they would. "Would you like us to handle this?" Martinez offered, noticing her tension. Elena shook her head. "No. This is something I need to face myself." Her children climbed out of the vehicle, their faces a mixture of shame and poorly concealed greed. Michael carried flowers, an obvious peace offering, while Rebecca clutched a baby gift bag, probably purchased at the last gas station. "Mom," Michael began, his voice artificially warm. "We came as soon as we heard. Are you okay? Is the baby—" "Her name is Sophia," Elena said quietly. "And we're both fine. No thanks to either of you." Rebecca stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "Mom, we're so sorry. We were wrong to turn our backs on you. We want to make things right, to be a family again." Elena studied their faces, searching for genuine remorse, but finding only the familiar mixture of manipulation and self-interest that had characterized their relationship for years. The pregnancy and their abandonment had simply been the catalyst that revealed what had always been true. "You want to make things right?" Elena asked. "Or you want to ensure you're included in what you've read about in the news?" The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken truths and years of accumulated resentment. Finally, Elena smiled, not the accommodating, peacekeeping smile she'd worn for so many years, but something new and fierce and entirely her own. "I forgive you both because holding on to anger would poison the life I'm building for Sophia and myself. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it certainly doesn't mean pretending we're something we're not." She turned toward the cabin where her new life waited, Sophia stirring gently in her arms. Behind her, she could hear Michael and Rebecca calling her name, their voices growing desperate as they realized their calculations had failed. Elena didn't look back. She had treasure enough in the child she carried and the strength she'd discovered in these mountains. Some fortunes, she'd learned, were worth more than gold.